Good to go.
All right, welcome to the Study Committee on Independent Police Oversight Commission meeting tonight, December 7th, 2020. Can we go into roll call, please?
Kelly Ellsworth Etchison.
Present from East Lansing, Michigan.
Noel Garcia Jr.
Present from East Lansing, Michigan, Ingham County.
Cedric Haro.
Present from Mason, Michigan, Ingham County.
Helen Josephson. No Helen yet. Chris Root. Oh, you're muted, Chris.
I'm in East Lansing, Ingham County.
Thank you. Eric Williams.
I'm here in East Lansing, Ingham County.
Tanya Williams.
Coming in virtually from DeWitt, Michigan in Clinton County.
And Ron Bacon.
I'm present virtually, East Lansing, Michigan, Clinton County.
Okay, Sade, Colwood, Sharon, Reed Davis, and Quentin Tyler have notified us that they're unable to attend tonight.
Thank you. And Chuck Grigsby, East Lansing, Ingham County.
Oh,
Present.
I missed you. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. I'm the least most important in here anyway. No worries. All right, thank you, Diane. Moving on to item 1.2, approval of the agenda 12/7/2020. Hoping everyone had a chance to take a look at that. If there's no amendments or change to that, I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
I motion to
moved.
approve the agenda.
Looks like it's moved by Vice Chair Williams and seconded by, I'm sorry, I didn't see.
Ellsworth Etchison.
Ellsworth Etchison, thank you for the second. Any discussion about the agenda? All those approved, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, so carries. And just for maintenance purposes, when you want to, please, I say this, if you want to make a motion or second anything, please just go ahead and raise your hand so I can recognize you. We do have a delay with the technology, and sometimes I don't get a chance to acknowledge or recognize people who actually raise your hand first and want to make those motions. So if you don't mind, please do that. And also when you speak, if you remember, please just recognize yourself. I'll try to recognize you as well, but let's just get in the habit of recognizing ourselves for the minutes. Moving on to item 1.3, written communication. Where first part of what we have is follow-up questions for use of force that was submitted by Commissioner Root. And I think we had an adjustment to those questions. I think we're going to put those on the next agenda, a modified version of those questions. They were quite substantial, and so we just came to a compromise to be able to condense that down and then ask the follow-up questions from that. Does anyone have any questions or want to make comments about that? Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
The only question, and I'm not sure on the modified follow-up questions, question number 7 in that, that was regarding 2020, and I was wondering if that should be regarding 2021. And that was, will ELPD write a report about use of force incidents during 2020? And so I was wondering if that should be 2021.
Commissioner Root, you want to respond? This is your question.
Yeah, I did mean 2020. The idea is whether there would be a report at the end of the calendar year 2020 about the use of force incidents during that year. An annual report concept.
Any more comments or questions in regards to the response of this written communication? Yes, Councilman Bacon, please.
Can I get clarification on, is that retroactively? Or what are we, I don't fully understand the response.
The idea is that the state of Michigan accreditation standards about use of force includes that a department compiles an annual report of use of force that analyzes their use of force during the year. And I know that the department is interested in going through the process of becoming accredited. So I was just trying to find out on this particular issue, whether this is something they would be doing this year or whether it would be later, when the accreditation is further along. That was where that came from.
Thank you, Commissioner Root. Yes, yes, Chief Johnson.
Yeah, we're gonna plan on doing what we have done in previous years for 2020 also. So we'll get the annual report out, by January or February of 21 from 2020.
Thank you, Chief Johnson. Did you want to say something, City Manager Lahanas?
Yeah, just a quick note. So we were just a little surprised by a couple of volumes of questions that we got that were rather substantial. So we would just request if it's easy or immediate questions that we have an answer to, and it's a couple of questions that we can get an answer to in a short period of time, we have no problem answering those anytime. But if it turns into a large, like a project type thing, it might be useful to have that come through the committee, because the committee is the body that staff is supporting. And then we can sort of allocate our resources to work in support of the committee. So if you have a large amount of questions you want us to answer, then for the next 2-week period, that might be the project we work on for that in that respect. So I appreciate Chris came out with a number of questions, but then we asked her if she could consider that, and she pared it back, and we're going to answer those questions, get them for her next week. Mr. Williams came up with some questions as well regarding police liability. I'm not sure if the direction was actually if the reality is what he was thinking of when he asked the questions, but I had the finance director prepare a good summary of our liability issues related to police, which are actually kind of minor. They typically involve fender benders. That's pretty much the big thing for the city overall, is sewer backups and fender benders. So because of that, rather than answering all the questions, we just sort of gave an overall picture, and now people have a better sense of what to ask going forward. And I think that's a good use of time. But just something to think about is that, if there are any questions that the group has, please ask them. If it's a big project, I kind of think it would be best if it comes to the committee and for discussion, because then the committee can say, yes, these are important questions. We want staff to work on them. And then that would be staff's work for the next period and bring them back to you. So just something to think about. Otherwise, if we have different people setting staff for different tasks, it could get a little bit burdensome and a little confusing for folks.
Yes, I believe Commissioner Garcia Jr. wanted to say something, then Councilmember Bacon.
So yeah, I've been looking at that document. Thank you, Chris. That looks extensive, and there's a lot of items there. And some of those items, I've shared my interest in getting some of that data, specifically number 14. So we're tabling this for answers, and it sounds like Mr. Lahanas is saying, do we want all these answered right away, or are we tabling these for another time? But I guess I need clarity on how we're going to move forward in the next couple of weeks about getting the answers to these questions.
Yep, great question. So the thing is, without any further knowledge about extensive questions, we got 2 sets of questions that were completely different. We got one set of extensive questions, about 20 questions on police use of force. And then we got a couple of pages of questions about police liability. So I don't know what direction that means the group is going. And is this a part of a planned discussion to follow up on these questions? Or is this one, maybe you guys have talked about it, but I wasn't privy to it, or maybe I wasn't maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention. But if there's an extensive amount of work that folks want us to do, it should just be discussed here and say, yeah, these are the questions we want. This is what we want you to do. And everyone nods and says, yep, that's what we want you to do. And then we will get your answers. But if you could see if every council or commission member starts asking different lists of questions, it's a tough use for our staff to accommodate that, because we'll have lots of different staff people going in lots of different directions. And it'll be, I guess I would say pretty burdensome or pretty difficult to achieve. So if we could just have it where it comes to the commission, if the commission wants all of those questions answered, look over the list and say, yep, that's what we want you to do. Answer those questions. And then that will be, like Steve is doing a special presentation this time. That's the work that he will, or we will work on for the next period of time. Same thing with the finance director. The finance director got an extensive list of questions regarding liability. We looked them over, and I wasn't sure if the direction really from the questions, if the actual situation really justified answering all 2.5 pages of questions, because I think a sort of pared down answer would suffice. If it doesn't, look at the answer and then ask more questions beyond that. And then we can try to do that in a stage. But, you know, I'm trying to be considerate. I'm trying to balance the need for the group to get answers to all of your questions versus lots of staff who are really busy on stuff and trying to allocate their time as well. Right? Does that sound fair?
Yes.
City Manager, are you all done? Thank you, City Manager Lahanas. I believe Councilmember Bacon wanted to have a comment.
Yeah, I think just in the spirit of time and anything that we want to move forward, we're still trying to move. If it's something you want access to permanently for the Independent Police Oversight Commission, that's a different question than information for information's sake or information not tied to the outline of how we're building out the Independent Police Oversight Commission. So, you know, kind of like a lot of boards, commissions do, restate the mission. If it's not tied to the mission of building out the commission, frankly, it's a waste of time. That's all I'm getting at. So if there's an opportunities, if it's non-vital to make a decision or fill out some subsection of the outline, then it's not essential at this point, because we're not that we can't create more time, but treating this as it's time bound. What's essential to completing something deliverable for council, and keeping that in mind, what's going to be the essential stuff to do that, and not getting off on any tangents or things like that. Not saying that we have, but kind of restating the mission and then building out from the initial mission or through the outline and some of the things you guys talked about in the last meeting, just hopefully to not get off track. That's it.
Thank you, Councilmember Bacon. Any more comments in regards to what has been said by City Manager Lahanas in regards to questions? I had a conversation with the city manager, and how he helped me out, really help understand it, was really working for the commission, not 11 individuals. And so I kind of really understood that. I understood how difficult it may be for staff to kind of really be doing their normal duties and also assisting us. And so I really thought that really wrapped up everything that everyone talked about tonight and the concern for that. So going forward, just have that in mind, I guess just repeating everything everyone else has said. So I'll move on to written communication. Oh, I'm sorry, before we move on, Commissioner Root, I think Commissioner Garcia Jr. Had a preference for question 14 for that future written communication that we released. Did you have that going into the next set too as well? I didn't see your final version of your other questions.
Question 14 came out of the discussion about the arrests report that was back in October, the presentation from ELPD. And there are a lot of sub points there. So the revised shortened list of questions only took one datum from that. Maybe we can, maybe Noel, you and I can communicate before the next meeting and figure out if we want to bring something back to the whole group. I mean, I thought that understanding more about who's being arrested was kind of foundational for us and the council to understand what it is we're trying to have oversight of. These are all judgment calls about what's needed versus what's just of interest. So I can talk with you and we can come back next week.
Okay. Yeah. If I think I heard you correctly, but I think you guys are going to talk about having question 14 be modified to be submitted for the questions that you have on the next one. Is that what you're saying? But
it's just one small piece of it.
Okay.
So we can, this is helpful, and we can come back to that next week and see how we want to handle it.
Commissioner Garcia Jr.
Yeah, how about, part of the reason that it's important to know this data, and it's not a waste, I don't think it's a waste of time, is it really relates to our subcommittee on reporting, the history and how we move forward from here.
Right.
And so maybe we can make this another task for our subcommittee, Chris, that you and I and Sade are on, and we can meet again and then report that way. I'm happy doing
Oh,
that.
That's a great idea, because that
Because it
that
really,
has us focus on what is the need for it.
in the report, yes.
That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you,
don't we do that?
Commissioner.
That's perfect.
Thank you, Commissioners. Yes, City Manager Lahanas.
I just want to say, I don't know if I didn't mean to imply at any stretch that any questions are a waste of our time. I just want to say, just to sort of say that it's the committee and you all want us working on that.
I understand. Thank you for saying that,
No
Jordan.
one, yeah,
Thank
no
you.
one's wasting our time.
Okay.
I appreciate that, City Manager Lahanas.
Could I actually just mention one thing on that point is that Eric asked about liability. There is a good general memo from our finance director that she prepared this week about liability. If you didn't get a chance to look at it, it has the city's retention and stop loss, how much the city is self-insured for, how much the insurance carrier picks up for, and then sort of a good general look at how that all works. It's not a huge amount of detail, but it gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what liability looks like for the city over the past years. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, City Manager Lahanas. And he's referring to on written communications, item 1.3, risk management questions, and then the answer or the response is under general liability insurance 12/3/2020, where that summary to look for. Yes, Commissioner Williams.
The history of that page of questions, and I guess Ms. Belposh's response to them was originally I had proposed that it would be good to have somebody from loss management and the insurance side of things to be one of our witnesses, and it was it was asked to me to, why should we do that? I should develop some questions to put that in context, why we might need somebody from a loss management to speak to us. And so that's why I came up with those questions. And I would hope that going forward, one of the missions of the Oversight Commission would be to periodically inquire into the claim history of the police department and the city, and possibly to participate in some of the loss management programs that the Municipal League and the Loss Management Authority have going for police departments around the state. And so those questions were posed to kind of create a context for why it's important to look at the insurance side of this activity, the financial side of this activity, rather than just the humanitarian side of the activity. So that's what the questions were, and I was glad to see that we didn't have too many claims outstanding. But I would hope that the Oversight Commission would keep an eye on that, because that's an important part of our mission, I should think.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. And I'll just, for full transparency, I talked with Commissioner Williams in regards to his questions or his preference being able to have someone come in and talk with us. And I thought it would be a good idea for him to present some questions in the format that he did for all of us to be able to have a conversation, discussion, and understanding for the reasoning for that. But I did not take into consideration staff time and the process and what we've been talking about here earlier in the call. So that is a little bit on me in the way that was presented. But I thought it was a great way to be able to get it out there and on the table for us to be able to have that discussion. Yes, City Manager Lahanas, do you want to say something?
Yeah, and I think it is a very legitimate question, because loss and being good stewards of the city's money is a imperative of ours. Obviously, we're more concerned that someone doesn't get hurt or injured, and more concerned with that than we are with the money loss. But money loss is an issue, and I think it's a good question to answer, because our experience has been that hasn't been an issue for us. It's been really an issue of municipal liability. I can't think of the last time our insurance company has actually paid on something. It's, like we said, typically sewer backups, and typically from the entire fleet, not just police. So I'm not blaming them, but it's vehicles bumping into other cars and damaging a fender and costing us a couple $1,000s. Thankfully, we have not had any of these large liability issues related to use of force or something of that nature. So a very good question to ask and something to keep an eye on. And it might well be something that this committee is a part of the recommendations. If we start taking a list of them, one is an early warning system tracking, and one might be to continue to look at on an annual basis, that the committee looks at loss issues and related to risk management on a regular basis or on a quarterly basis or yearly basis. So certainly part of the recommendations, that would be a good one to make.
That's exactly it.
Yep, you're right.
Thank you, City Manager Lahanas. Commissioner Williams, did you have any questions or any response in regards to the summary that you got before we move on?
No, as I said, I'm glad to see that there aren't any losses to speak of out there. Next door in Lansing, there are beaucoup losses, and it can change overnight.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. I think we'll go ahead and move on to the memo seeking agreement on info release submitted by Mrs. Commissioner Root. And I think this is in regards to kind of really what we talked about in our last meeting about just the automatic release of certain amounts of information pertaining to an investigation and the time frame of it. And this is just really where that came from. Is that correct, Commissioner Root? Yeah, so this was something that I had to ask for us to be able to look at. We don't necessarily have to go into it, but I thought it had some great points on it as far as kind of really a process. Did anyone have any questions, comments in regards to this written communication for the agreement for the info release? Yes, Commissioner Harrell.
Just a brief comment. There was a shooting in St. Petersburg, Florida last week. And I just happened to follow them because that's where I had done my research previously. And I felt the way that the St. Pete Police Department handled the release of information after that shooting was a pretty good model that we might consider. So, you know, there was within a day a press conference, but at the same time on social media, they were releasing information not of demographic characteristics, but of, you know, Officer 1 who was involved had, 2 complaints over the past 5 years, neither of which were related to use of force, neither of which was sustained. And so just that kind of setting the stage, I think that could present an opportunity for an initial information release to sort of allow the public to develop an understanding that the department is taking these sorts of things into consideration. There are things that are happening. We can't release all of the information because there's an ongoing investigation, but this is what we know so far. And all of that happened within 24 hours. The venue that I saw in was on their Facebook page. So I'm not sure if that's something that they also released, for example, as a press release or something along those lines. But I thought it was a pretty good model.
Thank you, Commissioner Rowe. Just a follow up, it seems like the document that we're looking at now and then your example was primarily based off, very serious things, shootings, and homicides. I want your opinion in regards to things that are less significant, such as someone being physically harmed and things like that. Would you still apply the same criteria and expectation, if you will, in your report going forward, even for those as well, or did you have a different opinion on that?
And I think it's going to be a sliding scale, right? And maybe we get into this a little more when we look at the history of complaints, but for something like a demeanor complaint, I don't think that would be necessary. I think from a public relations standpoint, if you will, anything that involves physical force, just given how much is increasingly available to the public, right? In terms of everybody standing around with cell phone cameras and these sorts of things. I think any use of physical force where there is a potential injury should require some release of information of that standard. If we're talking about physically, an officer has to put their hands on somebody to gain control of them and put them in a squad car, right? Then there's no expectation there. That's just sort of business as usual, right? So I guess in this instance, I would be thinking of something like what happened in Lansing last year with the runaway who was kicking out at the officers and her leg was caught in the door. Something like that, I think is serious enough to warrant at least an initial release of information.
Thank you. And I would agree with you. And, the heart of this, and this is just my opinion, but the heart of this is really that trust, transparency, safety, and justice from the lens of the community. And even though we may not, for less serious incidences, release everything and go all out, releasing something or having some type of flow of information, I think is very, very crucial in maintaining that transparency, trust, safety for what the officers are doing and what they need to be doing, and then what the community needs to do to understand why the officers did what they did or need to do what they do when it comes to advocating for some of those sensitive issues. Anyone else have anything else to say in regards to the document? All right, thank you. We'll go ahead and move on. Just double checking. I didn't have anything extra for that as well. All right, so we'll move on to Ordinance 1463, the memo. This was another document that was put in our written communication in response to our conversation that we had or discussion we had in our previous meeting. And just kind of really, this was something that was presented as a pre-version of what we're doing now to going forward, and how this was something that people really wanted to improve upon from what I understand. And that's how we got to be where we are today in achieving that goal. Is there any comments, reactions, or questions in regards to this document? All right, I think we'll move on. Go ahead. All right, community survey example from the COPS office is what it says. I don't usually use it that way, but COPS office that we have here. Did you want to lay this up for us a little bit, City Manager Lahanas, about kind of this example?
Yeah, so, obviously local government, we have a big interest in doing surveys of our residents. We've done pretty broad surveys for a number of years, not more recently, due to the preference of council. We haven't really done surveys in the last 4 years, I believe. Before that, we did it pretty extensively, checking to see with our residents what they think about all of the services we provide. What do they value the most? What do they value the least? Just sort of a general satisfaction of local government survey. As we started the whole endeavor of police reform and council's charge to us, and we look back at the resolution that started this group, the idea obviously is to improve police community relations. So what I would like to do at this point is to implement a survey with the help of a firm, not do it ourselves, but hire a firm through a brief RFP process, take the type of questions we want to answer, which is the Department of Justice type survey of law enforcement attitudes, ask them work with them sort of interactively and say, what type of survey do you want to construct for us out of these types of questions that gets at police satisfaction with our police department and perceptions of our police department. And then from there, ask sort of what size of a survey we need based on what we can afford, because, obviously there are financial constraints. And then ask them to design, is it a 400-person survey, that's going to be obviously demographically diverse. It's going to be diverse across incomes and across parts of the city, age, and all of that. And then have them design the survey, get us a price that we can live with, and then move forward and do a survey for us. The idea is to do a survey hopefully now and then perhaps in 2 years again, when we have some time to work on it. Obviously, we have a new chief in place and a lot of new direction that we're taking. This past week, 2 weeks ago, we started with our social workers, last week actually, working in the city. We're starting a lot of different initiatives, and we want to sort of know what impact that's having in the community. So the idea here is we haven't settled on a final survey at this point. This is all still in draft, but wanted to share it with you. So when you hear and see a survey, you can have a part of the input and questions and suggestions at this point, so that obviously we're not duplicating efforts here. If you want to hear from the public at large, I think, which is obviously a very important effort, it's always hard to get people to come talk at a meeting, but if we can use a reliable and accurate or valid survey of perceptions, and that we could use that tool over time, that's something that I think from a policy perspective would be very useful to us in terms of how we're working on this journey of police reform and building trust with the community. So with that.
Thank you, City Manager Lahanas. Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
Along the lines of surveying the community, would there be any thoughts to surveying the internal department? I think sometimes it's important to see how others see you, but then also understanding how you see yourself, because I think that can that can connect some dots of either connect them or help people understand why they're disconnected. So if you're doing a survey internally and everyone thinks that everything is A-okay, and then you survey the community and then there's concerns that rises up and those two don't align, that helps you understand what work needs to be done in shaping or changing the culture, the internal culture. So I think having one without the other may not really be as helpful.
Commissioner, may
Go ahead.
Yes, Chief Johnson, please go ahead.
Commissioner, you hit a very important nerve in my thought process too, because I actually teach organizational behaviors around the country, and one of the things that other departments have done is have a internal climate assessment, and I charged the deputy chief with that. Even if he remembers correctly, even before I started, I sent him an email to see if he can start working on our climate assessment so we can do our own stuff inside to see what was going on. And he actually got a draft to me already. So it is exactly what we're going to be working on, separate from the official survey, but we're actually going to be looking at internally a host of different topics that we're going to be gathering information on. So you read my mind about 2 months ago. So that's going to be in the works for 2021 already.
And we actually just also, under Elaine's operation, we've actually implemented an organizational-wide survey, a cultural assessment related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that's citywide. So that's sort of a look at the whole city's perceptions of that. And it may have information from a police department's perspective if people put the information and voluntarily did that, but it's really going to be looking at the whole city for the most part. So we'll have that information hopefully shortly as well.
Thank you, Chief Johnson and City Manager Lahanas. Great minds think alike, Mrs. Ellsworth Etchison, on that. Great job. Yes, Commissioner Williams.
I noticed in going through some of the material from other cities that sometimes as part of their oversight structure, a city will allow an oversight commission, or the city will put in its ordinance to do periodic evaluations of the police department and the relations between the police and the community. And those are written into the ordinance establishing the oversight structure. Mm-hmm. And there are outfits that will conduct these kind of evaluations, and they would include inside the department, outside the department, and evaluations of various criminal justice structures in the city. So I would suggest that we might consider making that as part of our Oversight Commission's mandate to seek these kind of periodic evaluations, and a thorough evaluation of more than just one point, but try and be comprehensive. Albuquerque has one, Albany has one, I see, and it's not an uncommon feature of municipal ordinances that we do periodic evaluations to see how the Oversight Commission is doing, how the police department is doing, what the community thinks, and so forth.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. I would second that 100%. Any other comments? Yes, Vice Chair Williams.
Sorry, your microphone had just cut out there for a minute.
Oh, I was just asking if there's any more comments in regards to the information or reaction. All right, thank you. We'll go ahead and move on. I just had a quick question just for clarification, City Manager Lahanas. So the survey that we were talking about, you're going to still figure that out, and then we'll be coming back on the 14th or after that and have an input on that. What are you thinking?
Good feedback that you want to provide us now or over the next week. Looking at the questions, obviously we already asked Cedric Haro because of his research background for some feedback on that. But I'm happy to take any feedback that's useful from people, and then we're going to go back and go to a professional firm at this point, hopefully get a draft of something. I mean, because they're going to tell us, how long of a survey people are willing to tolerate. I don't want to design a survey that's 20 minutes and that no one's going to take. So we'll go to the experts, take a bunch of questions and say, and we'll have sort of a layout for them, and then have them, after that interactive process, hopefully get like a final draft of what it looks like. And then we can bring it back here for a final look. But if there's feedback people have and you want to point us in the direction of some good surveys that accomplish this, I'm certainly willing to look at that and throw it into the mix with what we're doing here, because I don't want to do it and have someone say, well, you should have asked this. It'd be good to just try to get that up front and see if we can get a good survey that we can hopefully use over time to be able to measure. Ideally, I would have had this survey a year ago, because before any of these changes took place, we could have perceptions, and then we could have one, on a regular basis, which would have been great. But, that horse has left the barn now, right? So we don't get a chance to do that, but we can try to do it as soon as possible is what I'd like to do.
Thank you, City Manager. So I guess I'm a little on an island by myself here. So I'm just concerned about what our resolution is focusing on and having a special emphasis on racial, ethnic, and justice, and getting some information through that within this survey as well. And I don't know how appropriate that is, but I definitely would just say that out loud, just for the record, that I really think that's going to be an important aspect to get some type of information from the community in regards to some of those issues.
And do you mean surveying a broad demographic of the community, or do you mean touching upon those issues in the survey?
I believe both, honestly, but what I was talking to was more with the subject matter of it all, and asking the community about their perspective on that and how they think, for example, that, police are handling certain situations for certain different people and things like that. So, I'm just thinking out loud, but that's what comes to mind when I think about.
That's a very relevant feedback for us. So that's, yep.
Any other comments or reactions to the example survey? Yes, Commissioner Williams.
I put a couple of examples in the chat.
Okay.
I'll send those to Ms. Schaefer after the program is over.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. All right, I think, yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
I know that you said, the city manager, that you're looking at putting out an RFP for surveys. And there is a local company in town that does marketing research. I actually use them for our credit union. So I don't know if you're taking referrals for an RFP.
Feel free to send it to me, and I can throw them in the mix of the places who we send it out to, because we don't always have enough firms. And I think I need 4. I'd like to get, if I can get 3 or 4 firms or 5 firms that are local in the Lansing area that could do that type of work. That'd be great.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison. Anyone else? All right, thank you. Good stuff. All right, we'll move on to Cradle decision-making model, written communication, item 1.3. Who submitted this? Yes, Cedric Rowe. Can you lay this up for us and kind of give us a piece of context, if you don't mind, in regards to the document, please?
I mean, this was something that I had just mentioned last week when we had the presentation on use of force, in relation to some departments moving away from the use of force continuum to this more holistic, critical decision-making model. There is availability within the state of Michigan. The Michigan Tactical Officers Association puts on a training based on critical decision-making called ICAT, Integrating Communications, Assessment, and Tactics. And so that's obviously geared more towards critical incidents from a SWAT standpoint, but it is within the framework of critical decision-making in the sense of slowing things down, with the caveat that clearly that's not always possible. So I just wanted to make this available as a little more information on what that training might look like. As is, this is something that, and I have no idea to what extent it is, but it's something that officers are able to engage in as in-service training on their own, which means in some instances they may have to pay for it out of pocket. Some instances the department may pay for it. So it's nothing that is systematic or statewide at any point.
Thank you, Commissioner Haro. Did you happen to see a price tag on some of the trainings in some places by chance? Just out of curiosity.
I could look more into it. It's on the Michigan Tactical Officers Association webpage, but I didn't come across a particular price that I can see offhand.
No worries. It's not that important. I was just curious. I thought it was a very interesting read. I learned a lot just, based off, we talk about all these real fast decisions that happen all the time. And this is the first time I've really seen something from a community standpoint about what goes into those. And it made me honestly appreciate the challenges of law enforcement being out in the field and doing what they need to do when they come upon having contact with community members. So I just really thought it was very informative. So I appreciate you submitting that. I liked I liked a couple of different things about it. And I like when you think about what it's all about, it's about advancing police professionalism and then overall the police product. And those were two things that really I caught from the read that I got from that really just really felt like it had a higher standard when you had someone go through this training and be able to then test on this training and be able to kind of feed it back out to supervisors or the trainers or whoever may be involved. So is there any other comments or reactions from anyone else on the commission? If you haven't had a chance to look at it and go through it, I know it's a little bit long, but I think it'd be very, very helpful for you to just kind of go through it when you have a chance in your own time. It may be very, very helpful going forward with some of the different things that we may be discussing and deciding on ultimately. Thank you, Commissioner Haro. All right, Police Oversight Commissions comparison, which was submitted by Commissioner Haro, and I will call upon you again just to kind of lay context. Again, this is another document that had information in there. I do have some follow-up questions, but I just thought it was great stuff and information to look at. So please, can you go ahead and lay this up for us?
Yeah, that was just to sort of collate information that our subcommittee had put together along with what City Manager Lahanas had done, so that we can all sort of work off a common document that has these comparisons in them. It's honestly still a work in progress. You might notice a couple of question marks at various points, some fields that are not quite filled in. And I think some of that is just due to the fact that there's often a lack of readily available information about some of these.
Thank you. Any comments or reactions to the written communication from Commissioner Haro? I just thought it was, again, I don't know if I'm just built differently, but this was just great stuff. I mean, the information in here, for example, that I noticed in Muskegon, how they have appointed who they're going to have on there. They're going to have 9 members, 3 from minority organization, 3 from neighborhood association, 1 from law enforcement, from a different jurisdiction, and 2 at large. I just didn't, when I think about hopefully the end product, those were just some examples of the things I hadn't really thought about as a consideration as far as who exactly would be participating, and just how we talked about before as well, about how important it is for people to have certain kinds of backgrounds or have the availability to training when it comes to be able to make these recommendations and decisions once the oversight is in play. I noticed a couple different things that some of them had 5 members, some had 9. And I thought that was kind of interesting how that was different. It seems like only the bigger cities or departments were the only ones that really had emphasis on subpoena power, which I thought was interesting. And I don't know how that came about, but they were the only ones that I noticed that were a pretty significant size that had subpoena power. So I thought those are interesting things as we go in and think about kind of really what type of oversight we want to create and review, monitor, audit, and all these different things that go into that. I just thought this was a great sampling, if you will, in regards to that. But if no one else has any more comments or reactions to that, we can go ahead and move on. Yes, Commissioner Williams.
I was impressed at looking at some of these things. Some cities have what they call police boards.
Yeah.
And the name, the exact name might vary, but there are some police departments that are ruled by a police chief and some police departments that are ruled by a board. And one shouldn't confuse a civilian review board with the board that runs a police department. Like, for instance, Lansing is run by a board and they are over the police chief, but that's not a civilian review board. That's just the governing body of the police department. So if we're trying to set up something, or if a city is trying to set up a review board, it would be outside the police department and not over it. But as you go through the list, some of these committees some of the committees on the boards on the spreadsheet actually run the police department. It's basically another name for the police department.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Yeah, interesting. Yes, City Manager Lahanas.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. That's there in bigger cities. It's not uncommon to have a police commission, and the police commission kind of functions like a mini city council, if you will, because of the complexity of these large departments and the budget, complexity. They sort of delegate that whole budget process to a subgroup that's a police commission, and that police commission works with the police chief. So usually the chief still works for the mayor, but they would go just like a staff person works for a commission. The chief would go to a police commission and give them regular updates on the budget and the operation of the department. And you almost think of them as a subset of the council for the purpose of overseeing a very large department. But you're right, that's a slightly different function. People could still go complain to that body of citizens if they have concerns with the department, but it's not exactly the same as a police review, which is looking at past issues and policies and conduct and complaints. But that group still could get complaints. So it's a little bit of a difference, but that's big city. That tends to be big cities. You see that. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, City Manager Lahanas. Any other comments, reactions? I just thought, just for a factual point, to have a couple of these be built, created in the 80s, I just never would have thought that would be the case, which I thought was pretty cool. And then I think this was a great example for me anyway, to see that, when you think about the models going forward, that, it's seems like, especially for our particular area, that, having a hybrid mixture of different things, such as, for example, review, monitor, and some investigative type things, and just taking a piece here and there and really making it our own was something that made me appreciate that as well. But we'll move on if there's no other comments in regards to this particular document. All right, thank you. All right, we're going to move to item 1. Yes, Councilmember Bacon.
Yeah, I've been just not to exclude, but I'm never one to reinvent the wheel. Just the Ann Arbor Code and Commission, I think, is built up a lot along the lines of what you're talking about, makeup of the commission and that kind of thing. There's a lot of good. I was reviewing it. I mean, I'm never one to. There's a lot of things in there that, being a similar type of town, that would apply to East Lansing as you're trying to build out the actual structure of the document.
Thank you, Councilmember Bacon. Any other comments? All right, we'll move on to item 1.4, seeing none. Approval of the minutes of 11/23/20. If there's no amendments or changes to those minutes, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Moved by Commissioner Josephson and seconded by Vice Chair Williams. Is there any discussion in regards to approval of the minutes of 11/23/20? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. Thank you. And I'll just take a quick moment, just for the record, to let Commissioner Josephson acknowledge herself and where she's calling from, just for the record, to make sure we're official with that and everything like that. If you don't mind, Commissioner Josephson.
Yeah, sorry, I had a family call. I am present, coming from East Lansing, Ingham County, Michigan.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to item 1.5. Pursuant to MCL 15263 subsection 1, limiting public comment to 5 minutes per individual, I will entertain a motion to entertain that in regards to that rule. Is there anyone who would like to move that? I think I've seen Vice Chair Williams. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Harrell. Is there any discussion in regards to the 5-minute limit that we have tonight? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. All right, we'll move on to item 2, communication from the audience. Justin, do we have anyone on the line this evening?
Yes, Chuck, we currently have one caller in the queue. That phone
Thank
number
you.
is ending in 753. You may unmute and address the committee. Again, phone number ending in 753. Please dial *6.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Edmund Rushton. I just wanted to call in as we're about to discuss the complaint process here, and as we've been talking about use of force, that I would like to recommend to everybody that, as Commissioner Grigsby said, the objective of this committee, this assignment right now, is to develop or I suppose rebuild and restructure the systems of trust between our public and our police department. And this all started from the community crying out for the need of 2 African-American men that we saw treated very unfairly, and I think many in the city would say brutally, by the East Lansing Police Department, as unfortunate as it is. And one particular issue that those who were involved in the case of Umiwana Gasito and Anthony Loggins, one aspect of the pattern of misconduct that we were witnessing was falsified police reports. Now, obviously, I don't mean to drag us into a new direction here or anything like that, but I think as we are looking at this complaint process presentation, I think it's important to keep in mind that both the cases that resulted in us having this large conversation together as a community were seriously affected by elements of the police reports of both cases that were found to be untrue. In Tito's case, it was made clear on the police report that Tito never made any complaints of injury, even though you can hear him yelling over and over on the video that his eye has been badly damaged and that they were responsible for it. And no mention of that was made in the police report. And then in Tony Loggins' case, where Stevenson had claimed that he was bitten, and we saw no evidence on the body camera footage of that happening. So I would like to get all of your opinions, or whoever wants to speak, on the importance of looking at falsified evidence or for falsified police reports, and what you might be particularly looking for going forward as you're observing these cases, in terms of where you might look for evidence of fabrications in police reports. And then also, just one second question would be about this complaint process presentation. Obviously, there's no public comment after that, so I'll probably come in next week with more questions. But I am a little bit curious, and I would hope that somebody could ask the question during the presentation, as it would appear that public complaints, there has not been a sustained complaint from the public since 2017, and I would be curious as to what that sustained policy violation complaint was and what led to it being sustained. And then other than that, in the process of disciplining officers, it's something that concerns me, because we were largely on the other side of the complaint process, just hearing word from whichever authority was currently tasked with investigating this case as to where the investigation was and what would be happening to Officer Stevenson. And I'm glad that they've put in a process of deciding discipline, but I see no mention in this process, the step-by-step investigation. I see no mention of when a sustained complaint would be made public, or even when maybe an unsustained complaint of high profile might be made public. So those are just some questions that I think you should all keep in mind. And if any of you have something to say about where you would like this committee to go and how you would like them to address fabrications in police reports.
Thank you, Mr. Rushton, for your call and input. Did any of the commissioners or staff want to respond to any of the questions that were submitted by the caller? Yes, Commissioner Williams.
I can imagine two areas where if it's not already, it could be addressed. This issue of falsification of police reports, and that would be one, either in the city code of ordinances, and I think the city has an ethics section in its ordinance code, where any employee of the city that falsifies some information that is reported out either to the public or to some other part of the city would be subject to discipline and possibly termination. I mean, that's one place where I don't know if that exists now in the city code or not, falsification of a report. And the other place would be in the police department's ethics code or policies, where if an officer falsifies a report to the department or a superior or something that he has a duty to produce, then that would be cause for discipline. But those would be the two places, and I guess it's worth a question to at some point in our process to the department and the city. Is falsification a grounds for either employee discipline or police officer discipline?
I could answer that pretty easily and say I'd be certain it could be a grounds for discipline. So chief or deputy chief, I think that's probably in your professional standards already, that you can't falsify a police report, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, there's more than just discipline. It's part of our oath that we take, reference having a public confidence in ourselves, and there's no room for it all for falsifying any kind of reports. So that is a very serious violation in our department.
I recall a case that happened a couple of years ago in Eaton County, where a guy got beat up by a police officer during a police stop, and he had arranged before this happened a video, off his telephone. And he was beaten up, taken in, charged with resisting arrest or something like that. And the telephone disappeared in the Eaton County Sheriff's Office. later it was discovered. Turns out that his sergeant had stashed it away someplace, and the sergeant was never disciplined or prosecuted for that. It's a thing that one hears about frequently.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
Yes, thank you. My question to Chief Johnson would be, what would happen to a citizen who falsifies a police report?
For a citizen?
Mm-hmm. They make a false claim to the police.
Yep, exactly. That's a crime, you know, and so they can't, it depends on what they're reporting. If they're reporting a fake report of a misdemeanor, that penalty is a little lower than falsifying a fake felony. And those penalties are actually higher. So we take those reports very seriously also. And so those are actually crimes that we have investigated people in the past for reporting misdemeanors or felonies, and they turn out to be false. And so we've gone down that path of prosecution.
So I think my point I'm making is, I don't think we should treat citizens harsher than the people that have a sworn oath. And so that is concerning, because that sets up a very dangerous culture of cover up and all of those types of things, and just the misaligned trust that could be born out of that.
No, you have a great point, Commissioner, because this is relevant. I mean, it's related, but it's something that we found out in the past. Take an example of going to these bars. You know, these people who work at the front doors of the bars, they have let their friends in under 21. And so we have found that the bar owners is trying to do their best to keep everyone over 21, but then the people in the front door is letting them in. And so we actually found we got an ordinance saying even the employee can be held accountable for letting their friends in under 21. It's not the bar owner's responsibility. So, you know, you have a great point reference. Yeah, you know, luckily we haven't found anyone, well, in the last 2 months I've been there, someone who has falsified a police report, but I have no problems with taking it a little further too. It's just because it's the same thing. You know, we got to have the trust of our community, and we can't have double standards. And that's something that, you know, as we know, that's what this oversight group is there for, making sure that we are transparent in everything that we do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison, for a great question, follow-up, and thank you, Chief Johnson, for the answers. I just had a quick comment. You know, in America, you know, the number one reason for overturning convictions is falsified evidence. And sometimes that goes into the police reporting and how that's presented in some cases. And I guess, you know, it's something we hear about quite often, I think another commissioner said, and it's something that is not out of the ordinary to hear as it being part of that the demographic of issue. And I think for me, what I have trouble with is not necessarily falsifying, but leaving out and selective narration, and you know, which is a lot more challenging because you're not necessarily falsifying something, but you're creating a picture, if you will, of a scenario that really has a lot of ambiguity-ness to it. And so I think, just to follow up with what I've heard so far, that's really my biggest concern when it comes to that, and the issue that is surrounding that, because that seems more what I've experienced in some of these different things that we've been hearing about and dealing with as an issue. So then my follow-up question was for the police reporting process, and this is a quick question, but let's say you have an officer doing his job and he or she is writing up the report, and they have the body cam footage as well as part of that. Is there a process where an officer writes that report up and then goes back and looks at the video camera and is able to modify the report? Or is it just one is one and one is, how does that kind of work with the department?
I have the deputy chief answer that one.
Yeah, the officer is currently with the system that we have access to their videos. As soon as it uploads into the system, they could watch it. And in theory, watch the video, write their report from, recollection from the video. The system is configurable where we can lock down certain videos so that people can't view them under, certain circumstances. But we don't have that in place, kind of a blanket lockdown in place currently.
Yeah, thank you. And I just think that for me, I think it'd be helpful for an officer to be able to have access and transparency with that. So I definitely promote that when it comes to that overall. Now, just real quickly, and I'll leave this point here. So let's talk about when you have a police report, and then sometimes you have discrepancies or you don't have the video footage available. Let's say, for example, an officer forgets to turn it on, or there's some malfunction with that. Is there a current body camera footage policy that you have that officers abide by, or how's that work when you have the video cameras available and not available? So I know sometimes they get knocked off, and we kind of, as a community, invested in some better equipment, so that's less likely to happen. But how does that work with us, just real briefly?
So I'm sorry, I got off track here. Could you repeat the first part of your question real quick?
Yeah, I'm just curious when it comes to the body cam footage, the camera mechanism that we utilize in the city. Is there a policy that East Lansing Police Department has for that? So, for an example, if an officer forgets to put it on or doesn't turn on and things like that, is there a policy that you have that talks about these steps and any disciplinary action with that? I know we talked a little bit about this summer. And that was something that we were, just talking about. But I just wonder if there's something that's been incorporated by chance, or if there's been some revisioning of that.
Yes, we do have a body-worn camera or video system policy that is in place. It's called the Axon Recording System Policy, and it is posted to the police department's webpage, so anybody can go online and take a look at that one. It does require that an officer activate the camera during law enforcement contacts. So if an officer goes in to grab their lunch to, any of the restaurants, and they sit down to have lunch, they're not going to activate their body-worn camera. But if it is a law enforcement-based contact, they're required to turn it on. And they're also required to power up the system at the beginning of their shift. The policy is designed so that, in theory, if an officer wanted to try and hide something, or they purposely did not record something, they can be held responsible for a violation of that policy. If they forget to turn it on for some reason, we have to look at the circumstances surrounding that. If the camera gets knocked off of their shirt, or now their exterior carrier, we're going to take a look at the circumstances surrounding that to make sure that it was not an intentional, hey, we're not going to, I don't want to videotape this. It is a freestanding policy, and it covers both the body-worn camera, and it also covers the in-car camera as well, which operates off the same system, but they're just, obviously different cameras and different hardware sets that we have.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. That's very helpful. Appreciate that. Any other comments or feedback before we move on? Thank you. All right, we're going to move to item number 3, staff reports, item 3.1, East Lansing Police Department complaint process presentation. And I believe that is for Deputy Chief Gonzalez or Chief Johnson.
Well, good evening. Again, you got to listen to me again this week with this presentation. Hopefully I'm not too monotone. Justin's going to share his screen with us and flip through the slides for me. Tonight we're going to talk about the complaint process. I'll present some data regarding both complaints from the public and then what we call administrative inquiries or conduct inquiries that we initiate ourselves at the police department. One thing I want to just touch on before we get started with this specific presentation, Remember 2 weeks ago, we were talking about use of force, and one of the big things that we didn't have for you is to talk about demographics and where demographics intersect with our use of force incidents, because we didn't have a canned report in the system where, you know, we could run a report and it could spit the data back out to us for that. I said that, you know, I'd have to, the way we had it set up currently, I'd have to go back in and touch every single report to pull that data. In the past 2 weeks, we worked with the state of Michigan, and they were able to set up a demographic module for us, so we can run our use of force report. It'll intersect with the demographics of the individuals that were part of that use of force, and we should be able to pull information out from the system now in that manner. It is not perfect, but it is a good start. So we'll jump back to the complaint process presentation. If we can go to the next slide, Justin. These are a few of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. Policy and process is going to be a big one. And I'll also talk about some of the union contract requirements and considerations that we have to adhere to within the complaint and investigative process. We'll talk about levels of discipline and progressive discipline considerations. And I'll also touch on very briefly, because I'm not an expert on this, but I'll touch very briefly on an arbitration process on what essentially an appeal would be if an officer did not agree with any discipline or a finding of an investigation. And then I'll go through the complaint data as well. So we can take complaints from two origins. One, on the left side of your screen here, is complaints from the public. You know, that's exactly what it is. Someone contacts our police department anonymously or non-anonymously, and they want to file a complaint against an officer for any type of behavior. Those are, that's one avenue that an inquiry can be made, or an internal investigation, if you will, can be done. The other avenue is an administrative inquiry. Think about administrative inquiries as this is a situation where maybe another officer brought it to a supervisor's attention of wrongdoing. Maybe a supervisor found or observed some wrongdoing or policy violation on an officer. That would be an administrative inquiry. They would route that information up to police administration. It would be reviewed, and then we would go forward with an internal investigation, just like we would follow the same steps for a complaint from the public. The actual process of investigation is the exact same for both types of inquiries. It just is the origin of where the complaint comes from that is different. Go to the next slide. So the complaint against employee policy 5-20, which is also attached to your agenda, is about 7 pages and walks you through pretty much everything from start to finish, from where a complaint comes from, how we investigate it, who does what, and what the outcomes are. Any party can file a complaint. So if, for example, my friend and I are riding in a car, he's driving, let's say, and gets pulled over, and the officer acts improperly, he's rude, unprofessional. Maybe my friend doesn't want to file the complaint, but I could file that complaint on his behalf. And we'll still investigate those complaints. The investigator may reach out to the individual that was kind of subject to the misbehavior of an officer to, get their, version of events, but we will still take those complaints. Anonymous complaints are always, considered, and they will be investigated just like anything else. We will not arbitrarily dismiss an anonymous complaint. We will accept complaints in any form. So in person, over the phone, written communication, email, those types of things. We'll take the information and look at it and start the complaint process if we need to. One thing I want to note here is that we have 2 processes for investigations that allege criminal behavior. So if we take a complaint that alleges an officer stole, some property from a scene, let's say, we will run 2 separate investigations. One would be a criminal investigation for the alleged law violation, and the other would be an internal complaint or an internal investigation for the policy violation. Our policy states that generally the criminal complaint is going to be investigated first. Generally also a criminal complaint is going to be investigated likely by an outside law enforcement agency these days. The policy will state or does state that the supervisor in our detective bureau can investigate that, but it also has a caveat in there that allows the chief of police to say, no, we're not going to investigate this one ourselves. We're going to request an outside agency. Usually, in my experience, when we request an outside agency, we request assistance from the Michigan State Police. So, you know, I guess in theory, we could request the Lansing Police Department or Michigan State University Police Department investigate a complaint for us. But my experience is that we've always turned it over to the Michigan State Police. There's just another layer of separation there that I think works well. And then, of course, once that criminal complaint is done, we'll go forward with the citizen's complaint looking into the violation of policy. We can go on to the next one. So when we take the initial complaint, there's 3 steps that the initial complaint is going to go through. The first line supervisor, that's the sergeant or lieutenant that is working shift on the day that the complaint comes in. It does not have to be the direct supervisor of the employee that the complaint is on. Any supervisor can take the complaint. They'll sit down with the complainant and they'll gather all the documents and all the information that they need to get the ball rolling on the investigation. So, you know, taking the initial complaint usually includes sitting down with the complainant and making sure we have a good picture of what the complaint is, and then also requesting that the complainant do a written statement. It's not mandatory. If they don't do it, it doesn't mean we won't investigate the complaint, but it's always helpful to have a written statement from the complainant so that we see what the complaint is in that person's words, as opposed to relying on, you know, a supervisor to translate their complaint. They'll gather police reports, citations, the daily reports, the officer's log of activity, if you will, that we keep, that each officer keeps each shift. Any video footage and photographs as well will be gathered and attached to the complaint. We require that the first line supervisor route that complaint up to police administration. As soon as they have all the information that they need, it's immediately routed up to police administration for initial review. That initial review is done to make sure that all the documents are in place, that we have all the information we need to put this investigation together and assign it to an investigator. A report number is assigned, or an internal investigation number is assigned. And then we also have an immediate notification to the chief of police that this complaint came in. And we ask the chief to take a look at the complaint. They'll initial it. I've seen it, and we know that it's going to be assigned to an investigator to look at. This is a piece of the puzzle that is extremely important because, as you could imagine, things can fall through the cracks, and so we want to make sure that everybody, all the way up to the chief, kind of has a good situational picture of what's going on with the complaint, where it is in the process, and maybe at least some initial information. So the chief will review it, and then, can you go back just real quick? And make that determination whether or not it's a policy violation, criminal complaint, and assign it as appropriate. Okay, now we can move on. So the investigation process. The investigation will be conducted by a person of superior rank. Right now, Chief Johnson has said that all internal investigations are going to be completed by the rank of lieutenant or above. So we have 3 lieutenants on staff, 1 on each shift, and then 1 in our in our detective bureau. And we rely on those lieutenants primarily because, 1, they've got a lot of experience. They're senior ranking members of the department, and we trust that they can conduct an internal investigation properly. Generally, the lieutenant that is investigating the complaint is somewhere within that officer's chain of command right now. That's not always the case. Sometimes an investigation will be conducted by a lieutenant from a different shift or a different division, but generally they're in that officer's chain of command. We'll make notifications to the necessary supervisors that, hey, you know, so-and-so had a complaint filed against them, and it's going through the investigation process. We have to do written notification to the officer or the employee that is the subject of the complaint. That's a simple memo that generally comes from the investigator that says this complaint was filed against you. We are investigating it, and usually that memo is accompanied with a date and time to come in for an interview in the complaint. The investigator gathers all the evidence, again, case files, photographs, video, those types of things, and then we'll start interviewing anybody that is attached to that complaint. So it is possible that the lieutenant or the investigator is going to recontact the complainant and ask for another interview to answer any unanswered questions or information that needs to be still gathered that was not originally provided in the initial complaint that was filed. We're going to interview witnesses. Witnesses can be people from the public that may have been present, people that maybe the complainant says, hey, my friend was with me, talk to him, he can, or her, and you know, they can tell you what happened. It could also be officers, other police officers that were on the scene as well. So we'll talk to all of the witnesses that are attached to the complaint. And then obviously we're going to talk to the subject of the complaint, the officer or the employee that the complaint was filed against. Those complaints or those interviews are taped, they're transcribed for the case file, and are part of the investigation once they're in. One thing I want to point out is that the investigator is the finder of facts. So they put all the information together. Generally, they will make a recommendation to the chief of police of this is where the evidence per se is leading towards on this complaint and what the disposition may or may not be. But the final disposition is left to the chief of police after they review it and look at all the facts and make a determination. Discipline, final recommendation on discipline or a final enactment of discipline is also left to the chief as well. We do have a 90-day target to get complaints done. And I can tell you in my experience, very few complaints actually take that long to investigate. The more complex they are, of course, the more time they take to complete. But we generally do not run up against that 90-day window. So a couple contract considerations. You'll see this is from the POAM contract, and I think at the beginning of this commission being formed, we provided both the Police Officers Association of Michigan contract and then the Command Officers Association of Michigan contract to you. POAM is police officers, just like it says. COAM are our lieutenants and our sergeants. The two, the officers and the supervisors are in different unions. In the POAM contract, it does state that all internal investigations, whenever practical, will be conducted by supervisory personnel. All recommendations and or conclusions regarding the internal investigation shall be by supervisory personnel. So the way we do these and the findings that we come up with are not just set forth in policy and departmental policy, but in part they are also set forth in the bargaining contract that we currently are working with. Also, it does state in the POAM contract that any member summoned by a superior officer for any type of hearing or an investigation or interview where the officer feels disciplinary action will result may request that a union representative be present. So it is standard practice that when the subject of the complaint comes in for an interview with the investigator, that they will bring their union representative with them. That is generally one of the police officers that work here that hold a union office. So whether it's the union president or one of the 2 or 3 representatives that the union has elected, they will sit with the officer during the investigation. That union representative during the interview, at the end of the interview, is usually offered the opportunity to ask some questions or clarifying questions of their own if they so choose. We can go on to the next. At the end of the investigation, we have 5 different dispositions that are set forth in policy here that we have to find. Some of them, admittedly, are a little confusing. When I was a brand new officer, I always got confused between the not sustained and the unfounded disposition because they really sound very familiar. But unfounded really is the alleged act. We found evidence proving that the alleged act did not occur. Whatever the complaint was, there is evidence contrary to that complaint to show that it did not occur. The not sustained complaint is where the investigation did not provide or find enough evidence one way or the other to prove or disprove that the allegation occurred. We do have exonerated. Exonerated means that the officer's actions were appropriate, reasonable, and consistent with current department policy and training. Sustained, that's self-explanatory, but that means that the alleged act did occur and there was enough information to prove that. And then policy review. We do not come across this very often. However, you will see when we get to the data portion here in a minute. We did have one complaint that came back as a policy review because during the investigation, we found that while the employee's actions were within policy and within current department operational guidelines, we needed to take a look at those guidelines because we felt they were a little flawed, and policy revision was needed. So those are the 5 different dispositions we can find. So for sustained complaints, factors determining discipline. So how do we decide, okay, the alleged act occurred, we find that the officer acted inappropriately, violated this policy. How are we going to determine what level of discipline is appropriate? So of course, we take a look at the seriousness of the offense. We take a look at prior sustained complaints and the resulting discipline from those prior sustained complaints. Because remember, we're also working on the principle of progressive discipline. So if I'm a horrible driver and I keep bumping into things with my patrol car, and the first time maybe I'm told just be a little bit more careful. You know, I get a little counseling from my supervisor. The next time, maybe I get a verbal reprimand. The next time it's a written reprimand. Maybe I get a day off the next time. We look at that progression of behavior and discipline relating to the act. And then we're also going to take a look at the prior service record, and that goes towards that progressive discipline principle as well. Yeah, whoop. We go back, there we go. And then on the bottom there, you'll see the 5 different types of discipline that we have. We do have non-disciplinary counseling. Those are for minor complaints. Think of that as like a coaching session with the supervisor. And those are still documented so that we can track that behavior. The next level is a verbal reprimand. The next is a written reprimand. And then we move to suspensions, and there can be multiple levels of suspensions. Someone could get a day off. They could get 3 days off. They could get an entire month off. They could get 30 days off. But that is, a level of suspension that, can achieve in consultation with, both probably the HR department and the city manager will make that determination. And then, of course, the very end of the scale is termination from employee. Now we can move forward. All right, so a couple more contract considerations, and this is something that I think we've talked about briefly here, but I think it warrants further conversation because it is dovetailed into corrective action and discipline. So when an officer is disciplined, whether it's a coaching session that ends up in their personnel file, or it's a suspension of multiple days that ends up in their personnel file. The current contracts, you can see on top the COAM language and on the bottom the POAM language, but essentially it allows that the employee, after 24 months of satisfactory service in both situations, can ask to have their personnel file purged of any discipline. After 1 year in the POAM contract, it allows the employee to request the removal of discipline. That decision is left to the chief of police whether or not they'll grant that request. The language in both contracts are different. I will point out in the COAM contract, it does say all written warnings appearing therein shall be deleted, where the word reprimand is used in the POAM contract. So there are differences there that I think are good to point out. We can go to the next slide. So we'll talk about some data. I've got some data here going back to 2014, and I separated all of our numbers out from complaints against or from the public against an officer, and then administrative inquiries. Remember, administrative inquiries are those inquiries that we initiated internally as a department to look into an alleged violation. We do have 7 different classifications of complaints. I'll go through those real quick. They are in the policy. There's criminal activity, use of force, which would be excessive or unlawful use of force, discrimination, demeanor, rude and unprofessional behavior, traffic violations, policy violations, and then an other category. Those are our 7 complaint classifications that we have. In 2014, we had 5 policy violations. 1 was sustained. We had 2 demeanor violations filed against employees from the public. None were sustained. 1 was unfounded. The other was exonerated. On the other side, you've got administrative inquiries, policy violations. We had 1 sustained, 1 exonerated, and then we had another classification that was unfounded. Move to the next slide. In 2015, we received 5 complaints from the public. Those were for policy violations. Both of those were exonerated. And then we had a demeanor violation, or 3 demeanor violations, and those 3 were exonerated as well. Also in 2015, we only ran 1 administrative inquiry. It was for a policy violation that came back as unfounded. We go to 2016, 4 complaints from the public again, 2 policy violations, 1 unfounded, 1 not sustained, 1 for demeanor, which was exonerated, and 1 for use of force, which was exonerated. In 2016, we had 3 administrative inquiries, 3 policy violations. 2 of those were sustained and 1 was unfounded. Go to the next slide. In 2017, we saw an uptick in both complaints from the public and also administrative inquiries. We took 9 complaints from the public that year, 3 of them being policy violations with 1 sustained. 5 of them were for demeanor violations, and then 1 was for use of force. That 1 was exonerated. We also took 8 administrative inquiries that year. 6 of them were for policy violations. 4 of those were sustained, and then 2 were for demeanor violations. 1 was not sustained, the other was sustained. Go to 2018. Complaints came back from the public, came back in line slightly with what we've seen before prior to 2017, with 2 policy violations and 2 discrimination violations. None of those were sustained. And then we had 5 administrative inquiries, 4 for policy violations with a couple sustained, and 1 for a demeanor violation. That 1 was also sustained. And then the last year, 2019, we have 6 complaints from the public last year. 3 of those were for policy violations. 2 were unfounded. 1 was exonerated. Discrimination, 2. 1 was unfounded and 1 was not sustained. And then we had a not sustained traffic violation. And then you can see the administrative inquiries. We had 4, 2 policy violations, 1 sustained, and then 2 use of force violations. 1 was sustained and 1 was exonerated. So that's a quick look at our data, and I'm happy to answer any questions or take any comments.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez, for that presentation. Do any commissioners have any response questions in regards to the presentation? Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
Thank you for the presentation. I do have a few questions. Understanding that there is a collective bargaining agreement, but I wanted to know, are there examples of when a behavior is so egregious that you don't necessarily follow the progression, but that it could lead to immediate termination?
I personally don't have any examples that real life examples, but just because we have this principle of progressive discipline, it does not mean that violations could not occur to a level where a termination could, like that would be the first step. A termination would be the first step. I think the city manager and maybe Director Newman.
Yeah, so we've had situations occur in the police department where there's been a single incident that's largely caused termination. It happened with a police dispatcher and it happened with a police officer years ago now. But if there's someone involved in such a misconduct, I think for the dispatch situation, it was such a lack of appreciation of a bad call that put people's lives in safety and danger that that person was terminated because they didn't seem to get and grasp how to do the job. So it was that bad of a situation. No harm resulted, but the person's acceptance or understanding of the position, we had so much question about it that we decided to terminate the employee. If somebody in an employment situation were guilty, let's say, of theft in the workplace, that's something that likely would end in termination for an employee at the first step because you simply can't trust the person to work for you anymore, just like insubordination is usually a termination offense. But there have been instances in the police department where employees have been largely let go because of a single incident. There may have been things that happened before it, but the one incident was so serious that that was our determination to terminate at that point.
So, and I asked that question as a follow-up to my earlier comment after the caller called in. And because when there's a police officer that's making a willful omission of facts in his report or just fabricating the report that causes someone to lose their freedom, whether it's for overnight, a weekend, years. I heard Commissioner Grigsby talk about earlier that, and we all have read it, when people are let out of prison, I'm not talking about just jail, but prison, you know, there are people that are serving 20, 30 year sentences and DNA exonerates them. And so when an officer willfully writes a report in such a way that causes someone's, and to use your term, Lahanas, theft of their freedom, that could cause them to lose their job even because they've been arrested. Is that an example of, or does that have to still follow this progression? Because in my mind, that's egregious when you willfully do something. It's one thing that you forgot something, you didn't mean to put it, it's one thing, but when you know that you're filling this out and you have just total disregard for someone else's freedom in their life, then, you know, because I had some concerns when you mentioned in the report that you'll call in the Michigan State Police as part of the internal investigation, because then that makes me want to, the first flag that raised for me was, now I need to look at their record. I need to like kind of look at what their track record is, you know, to make sure that someone is going to be fairly treated when they go through this review process.
So yeah, if I saw someone who did something that egregious and that level of dishonesty, because I mean, if someone is that level of dishonesty, I don't think we can trust them to be our employee. So I would put that on a level with theft and that sort of a thing, perhaps obviously worse than theft potentially because you're denying someone their liberty. So I would think that that's, could raise easily to the level of a termination offense. I think what you might find happening more commonly, and I'm not saying this happens commonly at all, but is I've seen in my whole history of, 25 years of human resources and then being the city manager, is very frequently you have people who have completely different opinions on what occurred. Now that's a different situation. Two people see the same situation and they both have a different view of what happened there. And someone says, that person is lying. And we'll say, do you know that they're lying or do they actually believe what they're saying happened? So that's the one thing I would say is a difference. But if someone willfully falsified something, I would think that that would be a termination offense potentially without going through progressive discipline. Chief, do you have anything to add to that?
I would have to agree.
Thank you, City Manager Hollison. Thank you, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison. Any other commissions want to have a comment, question in response to the presentation? Commissioner Harrell and then Commissioner Williams, please. And I believe Commissioner Garcia Jr. after that.
I should probably know this, but I haven't had a chance to look recently. Is there a venue online for a citizen to fill out a complaint form, or is it something where they have to call or fill out some paperwork in person?
We have a, I guess for lack of a better term, a general email for the police department. They can navigate to that through our webpage, and that email automatically goes to myself, the police captain, the police chief, and also Miss Schaefer. And I can tell you my experience. We have initiated complaints through emails that come in of allegations. So that does exist for somebody to do without actually walking into this building and talking to someone.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. Before you go, Commissioner Williams, is there a quick question? Is there a notary process that the complainant has to go through in regards to that? Okay, thank you. Commissioner Williams.
I had a couple of questions. One was, if I understand correctly, the final decision on this, on these complaints, whether public or internal, would be made at the police chief level. And then it's possible that the police chief's determination can be appealed to an arbitrator. Is that the way it would work? If you have a complaint that's sustained, the officer who's aggrieved would be able to take the matter to arbitration, or the union would take it to arbitration?
Yeah, so what happens is really it comes down to their just cause standard of employment. So these employees have a property interest because they have a just cause standard. They're not at will. So the labor agreement really covers that, and that's what the arbitration covers. So they have a grievance process. If they were disciplined and they feel they were disciplined unfairly, they can appeal that through a grievance process, and the steps go through the police chief, you're right, and perhaps to the city manager, and then to an impartial arbitrator that both parties would select through the labor contract. They both lay out their case. The city lays out its case of why they think discipline was just, and the employee and their union lays out the case why they think it was not just that they received discipline. And then the arbitrator is free to make a decision based on the evidence presented. It's an adversarial process. We present our side, they present their side, and the arbitrator acts as a judge and says, I agree with the city, or I agree, but the penalty was too harsh. So I'm going to cut you down from 5 days of suspension to 3 days of suspension. Or I will take your termination, I will make it a 30-day suspension. Or I'll uphold it, or I'll get rid of it in total. So you're exactly right. That's how it happens. It could be based on any discipline up to discharge. Usually arbitrations do not occur for things less than termination or suspension, because if it's a written warning, a lot of times they don't go all the way to an arbitration. They might grieve it up to a certain step and have have the oral arguments between sides and then leave it alone. Perhaps the chief agrees to reduce it at that point from a written to a verbal, if it's 6 months later and there's been good conduct only on their part or something like that. So if that helps.
And do we have a history or statistics or a record of how many of those sustained complaints were later overturned in the arbitration process or the grievance arbitration process? How many sustained decisions by the police chief were sustained by the arbitrator?
We probably don't have that many of them because there have not been many things that have gone to arbitration. But there's been suspensions and terminations that have gone to arbitration, but it's been several years now. We've been upheld in some, we've been turned back on some.
The other question was, and this has to do with something I've seen in Kansas. Is there any reason why the city could not describe the behavior that is the subject of these complaints and discipline decisions, say without identifying the names of people involved, and publicize that so that we know what types of complaints are out there, what kind of behavior is being considered proper and what kind of behavior is being considered improper. Is there a way to go into the details of those complaints without revealing the confidential information for the benefit of the public, for the benefit of the police staff?
Perhaps for the police review committee, that might be something that they would want to do, is hear about complaints in a way that eliminates the name so it can be talked about more freely. Is that what you're saying? So
right.
They get a better understanding. Yeah, there may be situations where that can occur. Yeah, certainly.
The reason I asked that question is because I've been looking at how they do it in Kansas. They have a state level review organization. And what they do, they go through, they describe what happened, what the officer did. They don't tell the name of the officer. It's a state thing. They don't even tell what city this happened in, but they describe the behavior of the officer and whether that officer was ultimately punished or not. And it's very, very instructive for insiders and outsiders.
Yep.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Any other questions? I had a quick, yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison, go ahead.
So I noticed in the section where there were 4 discrimination complaints over like a 2-year period. 2 were exonerated, 1 was unfounded, 1 was not sustained. My question is, like, what does that body look like that is investigating it? Those types of complaints. Is it an all-white review panel, or is this something moving forward where now Ms. Hardy has her role as the diversity, equity, and inclusion administrator? Would she be then brought in as part of that review process on that for discrimination complaints?
Well, I think from my perspective, so as a city manager, I'm the chief personnel officer for the city. So the final decision of discipline and discharge comes to me. The chief, I would certainly err heavily on what the chief was suggesting regarding discipline and discharge. So the chief would come to me with the HR director and say, we had a situation where there was this complaint and I plan to take this action. Do you concur with that? If it was something regarding a complaint of discrimination, I would certainly want to hear from our diversity, equity, and inclusion officer and have that weigh into the decision of discharge or discipline or all of that as a part of that process. Yeah, and that would be a part of this whole discussion, certainly.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison, and the follow-up, City Manager Lahanas. Councilmember Bacon, and then Vice Chair Williams.
Yeah, I think maybe while it's fresh, just process-wise, where would the Police Oversight Commission fit into the process? Maybe be the question to tab into the spot right here. And then if you're looking for, in accordance with Commissioner Elbert Hutchinson's question, will there be a D&I component into that and building out that thing? I think you got a point of inflection where where do you want to fit in, or where should the commission fit in, or that kind of thing before we take on new data in a new way. And then I think if there's any agreement on that this appears to be a place where the future Oversight Commission should have a role. While it's still fresh, maybe considering what that role, maybe which point or where the inflection point is where they should enter into the process, may be a good place somewhere along here.
And that's a great segue into, I mean, that's one of the things that I mentioned earlier on about the Ann Arbor policy is a particularly thoughtful one, because as the chief personnel officer, I have my obligation to render a decision on a personnel matter. The way Ann Arbor handles that is, my understanding is that they look at it and make a review of it, and they can make a recommendation back, and they can have a sort of after the closure of something, they can do a review and say this was handled properly in their estimation or not, and they can come back. We actually had a recommended policy where we proposed one in East Lansing a couple of years ago, a draft, where what we said was this committee could look at it and make a suggestion or make a recommendation that I re-review or reconsider that discipline or discharge decision, so that they're going back to me and saying, we think you might have missed something here. And then that is more than a trivial thing, because there's publicity to that, and it's a public body that's making that comment. So, that's one of the challenges of making this recommendation of this committee, is there's lots of processes that this has to work within. And that's an area that I think if you look at some of these policies, you'll see some of those judgments about the point in time when they make their review, who their review recommendation is to, and so on and so forth. So good question, not necessarily an easy answer.
Thank you, City Manager Johannes. Before you go, Vice Chair Williams, if I understand what you just said, are you saying that the model that you spoke of, the Oversight Commission makes recommendations to you in regards to the disciplinary action or possible recommendations when it comes to what they get from the Oversight? Is that what you were explaining to us just now?
Me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, I thought you said Ms. Williams. So yeah, so what it would be is I would render my decision, and then the committee would have a chance to look at it after it, so that they would be reviewing all the documentation. They would be reviewing how that exactly happens. Again, is a tricky issue, because now we're getting to public and private stuff. They would review all the information, and then they would reach a conclusion at that point, and then potentially come back to me as a recommendation. So I have to go back and refresh myself on the Ann Arbor one, but this is where we made a recommendation for our own policy that was never implemented, that the committee come back and recommend to the city manager that they have a review of that they thought that the discipline was not acceptable, not effective, not the right fix, that this complaint shouldn't have been exonerated, it should have been founded, whatever it may be, to give us a chance to look at that again. So.
Thank you, City Manager Johannes. Thank you for your patience, Vice Chair Williams. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, considering that we're all here because we want to move forward and we want to do better, one of the things that stood out to me was that when it comes to a complaint being sustained, that disciplinary action is taken based upon previous sustained complaints. It doesn't take into consideration prior complaints in general. So my question is I know that you guys are also talking about an early warning system for the department. Is that policy going to change based upon the early warning system?
I think that's something you have to look at, because it's kind of, you have to consider, if you go into an arbitration, you have to be able to present these complaints and make an argument that complaints that may not have been founded are actually setting a problem that you want to discipline someone for. So it has to be sufficient to a level that your attorney can make the argument that yes, this shows a pattern of behavior. These were exonerated, but they show a pattern of behavior that we think justifies considering this current situation in light of these past issues. So it's not necessarily a slam dunk to do that. I know people say, well, this person had lots of complaints, but if they didn't have complaints that have been proven or disciplined or gone through a process, it's not always easy to rely on those, because then someone didn't have their due process. they could say, well, that never went to a hearing. Why are you throwing that in my the list of things for which you're disciplining me for when that never went through a process? So that's, I can appreciate why you're suggesting it, and that there may have to be some consideration of that, but it's not necessarily easy to do, to take past things that have not been founded and lump them together, right?
Thank you for that question, Vice Chair Williams. Great question. And it just sounds like, City Manager Johannes, that's kind of like a playbook that you would get from a union representative as far as them representing their client, and just trying to really have that tie in. Commissioner Harrell, please go ahead.
Just as a follow-up to that question, when the process looks back at previous sustained allegations, are we just talking about that 2-year period? Right? Or if something was sustained 5 years ago but has been removed from the officer's record because they asked for it to be removed, does that not come into play then?
So I think that's kind of a little bit of the art of the arbitration process. You may not be able to raise it in the arbitration process, but if the union were to say this person has a clean record and has never been disciplined, then you'd go back into that file of expunged comments and you'd say, well, that's not true. He's had 2 disciplines back in 2006 and 2009. They were expunged, but he has never been, you can't say that he's never been disciplined. He has no disciplines in his file currently. So it would kind of be used, in my estimation, to refute the argument that the person has a perfect employment record. But you would not come in, because they have been expunged, you wouldn't come in and say, hey, look at this from 2006. You know, it's 10 years ago, but I'm going to throw it in the arbitration, because the arbitrator will say, well, I'm not going to look at that. That's 10 years ago, you know? So that's, again, part of the art of the arbitration and your advocates arguing back and forth on that.
Thank you, City Manager Johannes and Commissioner Harrell with the question. I just had a clarification question. Oh, please go ahead, Commissioner Williams.
This discussion, to my mind, goes to the heart of what we're about, and the role, or whether the review commission should have a role in discipline. And I have a hesitation about that I may as well express now. Is, as you looked at the statistics of the sustained and unsustained complaints, the exonerated and unfounded results, you may have noticed that very few complaints are sustained, and even fewer still would be sustained after they go through that grievance arbitration process. No matter how you structure this oversight commission, if they have a decision-making role in the discipline process, it will always be recommendations. It will always be advisory to somebody. It'll either be advisory to the police chief or to the city manager. And if you look at the exoneration rate anywhere in the country, exoneration rates are very high. I mean, they approach 100%. In city after city, year after year, whether you have a review commission or not. So that if you have an oversight commission that has a role in this process, the oversight commission is going to be associated with exonerations. It's going to build a reputation as a commission that exonerates police officers. And that is going to play havoc with its reputation in the community. And this is something that review boards throughout the country have, is that they're always exonerating police officers. You can't help it. It's the American culture or something that's bigger than the Citizen Review Board that produces these results. So I have a question about whether the Oversight Commission should even have a hand in discipline for that reason. I think there may be other levers that an oversight board can pull that might be more productive outside the discipline process, outside the collective bargaining agreement, than jumping in and becoming a cog in this machine that produces exonerations.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. And I would have to agree with you too. I really have some apprehension in regards to getting involved with the disciplinary process. Not that has to be the case, but it just seems like all over the country, every commission that I've been able to have an opportunity to look at who has been involved with that, just like the data that Commissioner Williams was talking about, it really sometimes has worked to the detriment of the independence of the oversight, because the community is looking for answers. The community is looking for justice and sometimes understanding when it comes to this. And then if you have a body that's associated with discipline that really doesn't have any power to discipline or have the final say on how that process works, you still have the same things in place despite what that body is doing. And I think when I think about down the road and how we look and how we make this final report, it's really being able to get ahead of this thing and look at policies and procedures and processes that happen and being able to have access to that data and information. So then we can have more of a preventative than a reactionary body in place to have proper recommendations and reviews of what's going on when it comes to the police department. So I guess a long way to second to some of the things that Commissioner Williams brought to the table. Yes, City Manager Lahanas, and then please, Commissioner Root.
Yeah, so he's really gotten to the crux of the issue, is exactly what points in the process are you touching upon? And it's not necessarily an easy decision. And that's really gets to the rubber meets the road for this group making those recommendations. And that's why I thought hearing from a labor specialist, our labor attorney at some point, and that sort of understanding the arbitration process and the investigations, all of this goes to get, letting you see the sort of challenges here. But, a lot of thought has gone into this and I still struggle with it, but I can say that having recommendations up front and reviewing the policies and procedures and practices and making sure they're there and well communicated and the training's all up to speed. And if at the end of a process, after a recommendation has come to me and we made our final discipline, looking at it at that point is not really being in the process, but it does have significant oversight, because you don't want to have a public body that is continually disagreeing with your police chief. Because if we know, and I'll just, not necessarily me, but let's just take a city. If a city manager and a chief knows that everything is going to be looked at through a public body, then hopefully they're going to be highly responsible in how they are looking at those decisions, because they don't want to come up with a decision where everyone kind of scratching their head saying, that's an interesting one. Why did you pick that way? So that's part of the process here, is even if you're looking back at what occurred and offering a recommendation, there still is a real authority there in we all want to get it right, right? So it doesn't mean you have to be in the process and make the recommendation, but even the review of that after the fact has weight to it.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Root, I think you were next.
I have a thought about the process tonight. This is a really important conversation, and it is the heart of, part of the heart of the decisions that we're going to need to make. I am concerned that we still have a presentation on our agenda for tonight, and Liz Miller has been waiting patiently. I think this conversation is a very big one. And I think maybe we could continue this discussion at our next meeting. But I think her presentation is relevant input for us. And I'm also just, aware that she's been here and we don't want the meeting to go on, really, really late. And I think hearing from somebody who's been on the HRC for several years and has been hearing the complaint reports for these years will be very valuable for us.
Thank you, Commissioner Root. Councilmember Bacon.
Just last but not least, to address Commissioner Williams' question, that's the point of when you're writing the powers for the actual commission. So it's not a rubber stamp. If you want the power to dissent or to write dissent or to do something like that, you would write that or draft that into your powers. It's not saying you rubber stamped. You could be in total disagreement with the decision, and the commission could come away with the dissent or dissenting opinion if that's the powers that you want to grant to this commission. So that's the kind of the structural bones. If that's something that is going to be a sticking point or a point of contention, if you can't come to consensus, or George somehow or some other power overrides, that then this commission writes dissent to that decision and yada yada, then you're not rubber stamping the decision. That's you have a blank canvas here to create the powers that you would like this commission to have. So that could be something to be considered.
Thank you, Councilmember Bacon. Any other comments? And to Commissioner Root's point, let's move on and move to the Human Rights Commission HRC report by Commissioner Liz Miller with the history of East Lansing Police Department complaints at item 4.1.
Thank you all. How are you doing? You need a stretch?
No, thank you. We are ready to go for you whenever you're ready.
I just really first want to thank you all for the work that this study group is doing on independent police oversight in our community. 4 years ago, I knew nothing about independent police oversight, and through serving on the Human Rights Commission, I have come to learn a lot, still have a lot to learn, and I strongly believe that independent oversight is key to strong relationships between police and the public, to address patterns of interactions between the police and public, particularly as respect to protected classes in East Lansing, and to develop mutual accountability between our policing system and the public. So my first meeting as a Human Rights Commissioner was in January 2018, and it happened to be that meeting we had a guest, former Chief Larry Sparks. He was there to review the complaints against officers from the previous year. And prior to that, ELPD had only met with the Human Rights Commission one previous time, the January before in 2017, under previous Chief Murphy. So that relationship between the two groups was still new. There was no communication or standards or expectations that was laid out. And it was really in the chief's court to establish what the norms of that meeting would be. So in that meeting in 2018, Chief Sparks walked through all the complaints that had been closed from the previous year, provided commissioners with written descriptions of the complaints and the outcomes. I believe they're the redacted complaint forms. The chief went into details as Mr. Williams asked about. He really did that with us that night, and we didn't receive any demographic information, which right away was a topic of conversation. And so 2 months later, at our request, the chief returned with Deputy Chief Gonzalez, walked through the complaint process, very similar to the presentation that you all received tonight, and discussed what information might be available in the future to the HRC, including that demographic information. So we've been having some of these discussions for a few years now. So a year later, in February 2019, the chief and deputy chief returned for their annual report, but that year it was still up to ELPD to sort of set the standard of what the meeting was going to be. And that year the information they shared was much more limited than the previous year. Instead of the redacted complaint forms that we had previously received, we were handed a one-page internal complaint audit that said the type of complaint that was alleged and the result of the investigation. Again, very similar to the information that you all saw in the presentation tonight. So we, as a commission, it was up to us to ask a lot of questions to learn any of the details from the complaints that had about the nature of the complaint, the results, the officer, that anything that would be available to the public if someone chose to put in a FOIA request for that. So, and at that point, we were just asking for the prior year. It wasn't, 6 years worth of information. So it wasn't as much, hands on the documents that would have been required for that information. That year, we were particularly concerned about racial demographics because of a number of complaints alleging racial bias. We weren't provided information on what we also weren't provided any information on what officers had received previous complaints or had a history of complaints.
Liz, can you just hold for a quick second? Liz, can you hear me?
Which we really inconsistent, and the police department is in sole control of what information is shared with the public. And the HRC struggled because we're a body that we're tasked to do a lot of different things, and it was clear that independent oversight of the ELPD or with the ELPD was an important and overlooked role in East Lansing. So following that February 2019 meeting, we advocated to City Council for a strong process to create a group to be solely responsible for independent oversight and to develop the processes for consistency and transparency of information. So later in 2019, recognizing, it doesn't benefit anyone if every year the police chief comes and it looks totally different from the year previous, or we show up and we don't know what that meeting is going to be about or what information we're going to receive. So we developed a guidelines that we submitted to the chief 2 months before what would have been or what was our 2020 meeting. So these guidelines included a request to submit the information that they were going to share 48 hours in advance of the meeting, which is just HRC's accessibility guidelines. Previously, we had been handed the information while we were in the meeting, so we didn't have any time to look at the information or prepare ourselves or the discussion that we wanted to have. We requested to separate the complaints into the two categories, the complaints initiated by the public and those administrative inquiries. A lot of time in the presentation was spent on the administrative inquiries, and that didn't seem relevant to our mission to focus on protected classes in East Lansing. It felt like those were more consistent with just a traditional HR process. We requested that they summarize the complaints from the public to include, that included a complaint to racial profiling or other violation of a protected class, that we would receive as much information as we were allowed to about that. We requested that they consistently include demographic information about the complainant and the police officer, to include any complaint that is about an individual, an officer for whom there have been other complaints in the same year and in the previous 5 years. And that's information that we didn't ever receive. We also requested a report on any complaints filed against ELPD with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. So that's a state, you all probably know this, that's a statewide process. Somebody can make a complaint. So it seemed relevant if somebody had gone through that we should be aware of that as well. Again, everything that we requested is information that's available to any member of the public who FOIAs it. So we were really focused on that consistency and transparency piece. In addition to that, HRC is responsible. So once a month, one of us is asked to choose a random day that body cam footage is reviewed. And we had been doing that for, I think a year or two, and we sort of sent it out there and never heard anything about it. It was just sort of this magic thing that appeared in our inbox. So we requested a summary of those reports just of the day that we had requested, because it felt really imbalanced that we were asked to choose this day and then received no information on the findings. And I know some of our body cam processes and have shifted since then. So for this year's annual meeting in February, we did receive the complaint report ahead of time. Unfortunately, it was left off of our agenda. So any members of the public who are interested, and this has historically been an annual meeting that members of the public are interested in, didn't have access to it ahead of time. We never received the summaries of the body camera views. So HRC, I'm one member of it, but I can say, the last 3 years, it's, we've had a lot of discussion on this. It's been troubling to see the pattern of the overwhelming number of complaints from the public that were not sustained or unfounded or exonerated. The only 2 out of 35 since 2014 versus the over half of the complaints from within the department that were sustained. We've also been consistently concerned that it's really clear that once a year is not enough. The investigations are long completed, and although we could ask questions after the fact, we had no way of knowing what follow-up was taken from our questions or how policy would shift based on the dialogue. One example that really stood out to me from this year was we asked questions about the implicit bias trainings that the officers take, and Dr. Quentin Tyler asked about the outcomes and the evaluation of those trainings. How do we measure their success? And we were told that there's no evaluation of how effective the training is. The officers are not asked what impact it has on them. We don't measure the long-term impact of these trainings. The department's focus is, did they complete the training? Yes. All right, great. So Dr. Tyler was able to give the perspective of the importance of measuring the effectiveness of a training. So he was speaking from a commissioner perspective, but there was no follow-up process to learn if that had been implemented or if that, that conversation had moved anywhere past or out of the context of our HRC meeting with the chief and deputy chief. Over the last 3 years, it feels like, and I don't think this is necessarily unique to the police department, but it just feels like an uphill struggle to get consistent information or follow-up from questions in a timely manner. So questions and accountability to the public through the Human Rights Commission or any other body of civilians. It doesn't mean that our police department is bad or broken. We're coming from like a relationship perspective. And in contrast, I have seen in the last 3 years that the more open the lines of communication are, the more information that is shared, the more the public trust builds, and how important it is to have a reputable independent group that is looking at this and in some ways is the intermediary between the police department and the broader community. We've seen a shift in public engagement with the HRC around policing in a really positive way. Hearing from people who I think previously wouldn't necessarily show up at a council meeting or go directly to the police department, but slowly seeing that there is a group that is advocating on behalf of the public and bringing a different lens. I think systems of policing have a very specific lens, and it is super helpful. And I think that similar to you all are bringing very specific gifts. Some of those overlap with that and some of them are different. And I think those additional perspectives are really important for a more holistic, safe model in our community. Like asking about training outcomes and evaluations. That question could have only come from Dr. Tyler on our commission. Or like understanding that the race of complainants and officers is relevant in a complaint about racial bias, or understanding the overall patterns of traffic stops and arrests in relationship to demographics to see if implicit bias is at play. So we need people with those lenses to be a part of the accountability structure with the ELPD. And beyond just looking at, you know, the outcomes of investigations or reviewing those, looking at policy and making recommendations to policy changes from those, bringing those different lenses into play. Yeah, so I'm going to provide like a written summary of this after the fact, but I'd ask, like, do you guys, what questions do you have for me? What more do you want to know?
First off, Commissioner Miller, I just want to say thank you for one, being patient with our long-winded discussion tonight, and then also being available to provide us that information. And we really definitely would appreciate us, you know, a written up summary of all this so we can tie this into some different things we'll be doing going further. So I just want to say that on behalf of the commission overall. Do any other commissioners have a response question for Commissioner Miller while we still have her? Yes, Commissioner Williams.
Oh, you caught me unmuting myself. I don't have a, I haven't thought of a question yet.
No worries. Does anyone have any questions, comments? You know, I'll just say that's a lot to unpack. As some of you know, I do serve with Commissioner Miller in regards to the HRC. And, you know, I really think that it's very, very important. Two things that she talked about was consistency in the cooperation, in the relationship, ongoing, and improving upon that place as opposed to going back and forth and pull and tug. I really, really think that's going to be very, very helpful to both sides who are involved when it comes to these sensitive issues. And then transparency of the information. So we're able to really look at this stuff, really do a proper overall analysis of what's in front of us and being competent to be able to do that because we have all the information in front of us. Those were two main key things that were really, really sensitive learning points for me being involved in hearing the presentation tonight, and how important it is going forward when it comes to the community's perspective and also the law enforcement's perspective. So I just wanted to comment on that. If there's no other comments or questions for Mrs. Yes, Commissioner Williams.
I thought of a question. I was just talking about the appearance that could sour the reputation of a citizen review board if it was implicit in a process that exonerated police officers. Now, I'll ask you a question since you're, I'll consider you a member of the public, even though you're a member of a city commission. What do you think the public would, how do you think the public would react to an oversight commission that had the kind of track record that Deputy Chief Gonzalez was just describing for us, that did exonerations on a rather consistent basis?
So I tend to be a both and person rather than an either or. I think that would be challenging. I think it would be challenging to buy public buy-in and trust from independent, you know, commission perspective. And I think if that's the only thing that group is doing, it could be quite problematic. But if that group was also involved in policy, of looking at our policies that everyone here has inherited and have been tweaked along the way, and making sure that they are speaking to the values and the integrity of the city today, and that I think, and, making recommendations and really making sure that we, policies always change, that we are at the forefront of those changes as a community. I think if that work was being seen and done in conjunction with that, it could be, I don't know. Yeah, I think it'd be challenging though.
Thank you. Any other questions while we still have Commissioner Miller on the line? Comments? Commissioner Miller, we really appreciate you coming on tonight. Really appreciate you again being patient with us, and your information and your experience is going to be valued to our recommendation and report ultimately. And we appreciate you coming in and doing this for us tonight.
No problem. Thank you guys for doing this week after week.
Thank you so much. Talk soon.
Chair, could I just make a comment quickly?
Yes, please. I wish you would got it. Wish you still here.
Yeah, just this is not specific to that. It's come up a number of times regarding the complaint process. And I also just want to sort of make a comment the other direction, and it may not be a popular comment, but the fact that there are not a lot of complaints that are founded does not mean the process doesn't have integrity. So I think people could imagine that sometimes when people get in trouble, they want to blame the person who's getting them in trouble and make a complaint. So I would just leave people open to the fact that perhaps there are not that many complaints that are founded. And when we have 10 complaints in a year and only 1 is founded or 2 is founded, it doesn't mean the process is necessarily lacks integrity. There might be something in there that, that didn't come up because it wasn't, the right evidence wasn't seen, but it doesn't mean necessarily that the police are doing something wrong that is being hidden or not being found. I just want to present that as an option to people to keep an open mind about that.
Thank you, City Manager Lahana said, it's not necessarily not popular when it's just, based on the point of view where you guys are sitting and understandable. Yes, Commissioner Josephson.
I don't remember exactly what statistic I was looking at, but it's, I think across the nation, it was talking about how complaints are sustained versus the ones that aren't sustained versus the ones that are exonerated, et cetera. And I think nationwide, it's not as many complaints are sustained as one would think. So just kind of to go along with that kind of other side of the spectrum, I think that is something to look into as well, or just at least acknowledge, not to discredit what we're doing here, of course, but just to we both understand both sides of the perspective.
Thank you, Commissioner Josephson. Did you have something to say, Commissioner Root, and then Commissioner Harrell?
I don't know if either George or the people in the police department have this information or know if it's available, but Mr. Gonzalez pointed out that the outside agency that ELPD goes to when it needs to go someplace is the Michigan State Police. And what I'm wondering is whether there is data about cases that have been forwarded to the Michigan State Police and what happens to them. What the status was going in to there and what the status is coming out. Because I learned a lot when I saw that 2 East Lansing PD cases went to the Michigan State Police. One of them, ELPD had decided that there was insufficient evidence to decide either way, and Michigan State Police exonerated. And the other one, ELPD didn't finish its investigation, but told the city council they were very, very concerned about what they saw, and MSP exonerated. So I'd be interested if, in terms of our situation in Michigan, if it's possible to get data about the record of how MSP investigations turn out. Is that something we can get information on?
It exists, so we can ask the department that. I think one thing you might see from what you saw from that snapshot, what you're speaking about,
right,
is that this is me just giving my anecdotal, so take that as what it is. I think that the state police see a lot more across the state and see things that are bad. And when they see something in East Lansing, it may not look as bad as something they see a more serious thing, like an unjustified shooting, let's say, or something that is serious, like life-ending serious potentially. So I think their calibration may be a little bit different than potentially what we would expect from our officers. And that's just me giving you my snapshot of looking from my position. But I don't know if the chief has any opinion on that. I don't know if the data exists that you're looking for, but it might be interesting to see. But I don't know.
Chief Johnson? Did you have something to say, Chief Johnson?
I was waiting for Councilman Bacon had something. I'm not too sure.
Oh, just a quick second. Commissioner Harrell was before Councilmember Bacon. Please go ahead.
I wanted us to keep in mind that long-term, one possibility is that we, over the next few years, actually see more complaints, right? And that may be a function of greater trust, right? So, sort of paradoxically, greater trust in the police. That there may be a function of people feeling nothing's going to happen, so why bother complaining, right? We talk about this in terms of the crime rate. If the crime rate goes up because the police are making more arrests, maybe that's because the police are getting better at making arrests, not because crime has gone up in the sense of more crimes being committed, right? So, we may see a short-term spike in the number of complaints. That doesn't necessarily mean that ELPD is doing worse than previous years. It may, in fact, mean that trust from the community has gotten better.
Duly noted, Commissioner Harrell. Thank you. Councilmember Bacon.
Yeah, you kind of stole my thunder on that. I anticipate the commission kind of similar to why did people vote in Atlanta? Because they could win. The point is that there's a channel and a pathway to winning if they feel they've been wronged or that kind of thing. And that pathway existing, a path to victory, inherently is going to make more people vote. And then secondly, the lens, this commission is the lens. It doesn't matter what the state police say or what George says or what I say. Is this East Lansing? Does the behavior of what just occurred match with the culture and the nature of the community you want to live in? That's so you may not agree. So there's no way for the commission to necessarily line up and rubber stamp anything, because culturally we may disagree and procedurally it may be okay. That's what we're setting up here. That's how I view it. They could go totally different directions. It's independent. That's what the independent on the front of it, I assumed, meant in the title. So there could be times where there's synergy and there's times when there's total disagreement. And I think that's appropriate. And that's how it should be. There should be times where it doesn't match up.
Thank you, Councilmember Bacon. And for the sake of time, I think we need to move on. Unless you have something you need to express, and we'll move on right after that. Commissioner Josephson.
I just want to say, I just sent in the chat, just ironically, we are learning about these independent review boards in class right now. And a couple of the links that we've included in our presentations, I put in the chat. Some of the information is from 2002 and 2006, so it's not as updated, but it talks about how many complaints by the police are sustained versus not sustained and why. So in case anyone wanted to look into that.
Thank you, Commissioner Josephson. I think we'll move on to our next agenda item here, which is going to be new business 5.1, planning for meetings December 14th in January in regards to maybe what we've discussed tonight and where we're at as a commission. I'll entertain some thoughts about recommendations about what we should be focusing on or trying to get accomplished here in regards to our 14th December meeting. I know we'll be talking a little bit with George in regards to the surveys and things like that. I don't think that'll take too much time of the meeting based on kind of how we'll go about that. And I know we do have the outline of the report that we're working on, and we'll get a report back from Dr. Tyler as far as that first part of the draft, and we'll be discussing that a little bit. But I'm curious to see where we're at now as a body, as a commission, for us to kind of really determine and focus on what we need to focus on. Because as you guys know, we will be meeting next Monday, and we'll need to get things turned around pretty quickly with the agenda by Wednesday at the latest and submit it and and done. So I kind of wanted to open up the floor real quickly in regards to your thoughts on that. Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
I would really love it if we can have some more meaningful conversation around this topic of the internal complaints, or having the Michigan State Police be part of this review. And I'm thankful that there's going to be this oversight committee that we're working towards having, so that there is some of this independence review part brought into it. I think that's just going to be critically important of where this will move forward, how complaints will be addressed moving forward. Not how they've always been addressed, but how they will be addressed moving forward. So we can have some more conversation around that. I think that's going to be important. As I said earlier, you know, my antenna raised when I heard that the Michigan State Police are brought in as like part of the internal review. And I'm not certain that that is a neutral body that's reviewing these complaints.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison. And I apologize if I'm just not getting it. So when you talk about internal complaint review, more discussion, are you referring to possibly have us submit information in regards to that around the country? What are you kind of generally thinking as far as how that discussion could be processed in our meeting going forward, if you have an idea?
Yeah, that could be part of it, is one, getting some research on it, but just two, just not having the, you know, police each other. And so what can that look like moving forward with this, with the Oversight Commission that we're looking to put in place? And so I just have concerns about, you know, not saying that this is kind of like the good old boys network, but that's what it smells like to me when you're having, and that seems probably really harsh. I don't really know how to package it up any differently. So I apologize if anyone's offended by that comment. But I just think that we need to take a look at that, what we're going to have this commission moving forward that's going to be put in place, what they're going to be looking at, and what their role will be in addressing complaints and reviewing complaints.
Thank you for that clarification, Ellsworth Etchison. Did you have something to say you wanted to add in, Commissioner Root? You're muted.
Sounds really helpful. I hadn't formulated it in exactly that way, that they're playing a role and the Oversight Commission is playing a role. How do these things work? I think if we could get more information about how they handle the complaints reviewed to them, it would be beneficial. I mean, George's comment was interesting, you know, from his individual knowledge of history, but if we could get some more data, that would be marvelous. And the way you express how we need to think about it is really helpful.
I would agree. Any other input or comments in regards to planning going forward in the discussion? City Manager, or please go ahead, Commissioner Root.
Well, in addition to continuing to talk about complaints and, you know, kind of an overview idea of how we might recommend that an Oversight Commission would function here on the complaints issue, we don't have a speaker next, or, you know, any kind of presentation next week. So I wonder whether we can just think about a couple that we might want to have come up in January or February. You know, George brought up the idea of having a labor lawyer talk, and I think we are, you know, close to being ready for that. And also, I think we'll be talking about the survey. I think we also should probably talk about whether we want a public input session of the study committee, where we focus, where we do more publicity and have an event, a meeting that's really focused on getting comments from the public on some questions that we would plan. So I wonder, maybe next week we could talk about that a little bit, and then maybe, depending on how that conversation goes, maybe a subgroup could work on that a little bit more before our next meeting, so that we could put together a really carefully organized event to get public input.
Thank you, Commissioner Root. So are you saying that you would entertain the thought of having a subgroup discuss in between this meeting and the next one in how we formulate our public input session going forward? Is that what you were saying?
Well, what I was thinking maybe is we could have a little discussion of it as a whole group on the 14th. And then we could, out of that, we can see whether it would be helpful to have a subgroup take it to the next point before the meeting after that.
Sounds
if
fair.
we do a subgroup now, we're going to, we have never discussed it, and that group isn't going to know anything about what the whole body thinks.
All right. Thank you for that clarification. And just jumping back to Commissioner Ellsworth-Etchison's point, when we talk about research information and how that's going to be done, are people kind of going off in their own ways and finding what they find and then submitting it? Or, how are you looking at how we have something of substance for our next meeting when we all meet together, if that makes sense at all? Any feedback on that? Yes, Commissioner Root.
One thing that I think would be valuable for continuing the discussion about how to handle complaints is for this body to have the opportunity to look at the kinds of material that the HRC has been receiving. I could put together some sample of that stuff and provide it for the written comments for the agenda for next week, if that would be helpful.
Yes, I really want to make sure before you go off and do that work, because it will be work, if the commission is going to appreciate that information, if that's something that you think is going to be valuable to a better understanding of what we're working on. Is that something that you think is worthwhile as a whole group? I see a head nod from Commissioner Rowe. Anyone else?
No, I do think, there's work that's already been gathered, some data and research that's already been gathered from the HRC that could be helpful. Otherwise, I think we would have to steer our attention and energy towards what maybe some other oversight committees are doing if we want to look at what an independent complaint process might look like.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes, Councilmember Bacon.
On the questions around labor, I know there's certain powers or draft powers that you want to create for should you have the draft powers in place and then bring them in front of labor and see what that maybe would look like, what you're going to ask for. And then that could be a dry run at kind of your ask. And we can see, it's not really an ask. This is what the powers we want for this. And here's, if you're going to have a labor conversation around that, is that what we're looking at, George?
Well, I think once the group gets where they want to be, I think certainly having it reviewed by labor and having it reviewed by our city attorney, because there's not just the labor contract and labor issues, there's also the issue of the city charter. So having something reviewed in terms of both of those would be useful to make sure it's doable, and then giving that advice back to the group. But what order you do that in, that's why I mentioned, I think reviewing that Ann Arbor policy is a good idea, because it hits upon a lot of these issues that Ann Arbor has struggled with, the exact same stuff we're all thinking about tonight, the same stuff that Eric was mentioning, the same stuff we're talking about. They've already struggled with this, and you can read it in their policy when you look at the decisions they make, the timing, the use of data, all of that stuff is not going to be unique to us. So it would be worthwhile we can do it, have the group, have our labor attorney come in and talk sooner, or have them come in once we have something to respond to. It's kind of up to the group. I don't want to get ahead of you and have them come and you'll want them to come back. Well, we can't do it both. We can have them come back again too. But what's useful for the group, we're just trying to figure out what the order is for you guys. What's the most useful resource for you in order?
Thank you, City Manager Lahanas. All right, I think we have enough for the following meeting as far as our planning and discussion of the topic and the content, at least for the next one coming up here, and getting that turned around. I'm going to go ahead and move on if that's all right with everyone else.
Just
Yes, Commissioner Root.
one quick thing. George, you mentioned that we would benefit from having input from the city attorney about the city charter. Is that something that we could ask to have written up? And then, maybe we'll want to have, getting it sooner rather than later, I think is definitely good. And then we could have a different kind of conversation if the city attorney also came to be with us, if we already had the benefit of some basic understanding.
And I was thinking more from the fact that if the committee is recommending something that could be that would challenge the charter, that the city attorney could make an opinion on that. For instance, that if the commission wanted to have a commission that oversees the police department, I'm not saying you're going to recommend that, but that was something that was talked about as like some cities have a city commission. If you say we should have a police commission, that has implications for the charter. What does that mean for the police chief's role, for my role? What is it, what does it say in the charter about the fact that we have a police chief that runs the department? Those are the type of things that I think that if you recommend that, you'll want to have the city attorney look at that, come speak about the issues perhaps, so that it's all, it all works with the charter. It doesn't get to the council level and then they say, well, this is not doable anyway. This portion is not doable. Why did we recommend it? That type of thing. It's just to try to free the group up and give good information at the right time.
Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to item 6, subcommittee reports. Is there any updates in regards to 6.1 or 6.2 on group 1 or group 2? All right, we'll go ahead and move on. Any commissioner announcements or things you guys want to get across to the committee as a whole right now for item 7? All right.
Well,
yes, Commissioner Rowe.
This is just, it really fits into the previous discussion, but very briefly, in East Lansing, there is a court order that complaint forms must be released if there's a FOIA asking for them. And the court order indicates how that form is to be redacted. And so the policy in East Lansing is that the complaint forms have to be available, which also says what the disposition is at the bottom, and it does include the name of the police officer. That is very unusual. That is different from a lot of other places in the country. So I just thought I might mention that now so that as you're looking at other things, you realize that that's something that is different in East Lansing. And I'll provide that court stipulation so you can take a look at it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other commissioners with announcements or statements or questions? All right, we'll move to old business. We have none. And we are down to our adjournment item on the agenda. Is there anyone who will entertain an adjournment of the meeting tonight? A motion.
So moved.
Moved by Commissioner Williams and seconded by Commissioner Ellsworth Edgison. I don't think there's any discussion. Thanks for the long-winded conversation and dialogue tonight. I know we went over our time, but I hope it's going to be worth it in the long run for us, and hopefully we'll have a quicker one next time. Thank you, everyone. All those in favor of saying of adjournment, please say aye.
Aye.
If you oppose, thank you so much. Thank you, staff tonight. I know you guys were on here and you really gave us the information that we had asked for. You're being compliant to the things that we're asking for and working with us. I'm definitely noticing that. I'm sure the other commissioners are appreciating that. And we just want to say thank you for staff, for your help and assistance when it comes to this good work that we're all part of. So thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.